Hello everyone, and welcome to the 8th edition of Data Matters, brought to you on a Thursday this week as it's a holiday in the UK tomorrow for the 75th anniversary of BE Day. I'm delighted to be joined as usual by my partner Steve Wright. Hello Steve.
Hello.
And today we've got a special guest, Gloria Bégu. Welcome Gloria.
Hello.
Nice to see you. So Gloria is the former data protection manager at Gamesys, and she's here to talk to us about a subject that really couldn't be more topical, actually, should I say, than typical, privacy by design, now known under Articles 25 and 35 of the GDPR by the altogether less catchy name of data protection by design and default. Privacy by design is not a new concept, but I think perhaps in some cases it's been somewhat overlooked by the more well-known security by design process employed by organisations now for many years. So this week, in the UK's controversial employment of a centralised health data app, we didn't hear from the data protection officer, but we heard from the technical security lead around how privacy and security will be addressed. And this, despite the likelihood that the public won't be able to request that data collected is deleted. It might actually be used for other purposes, and the UK government are relying on citizens' sense of civic duty to share their data in the public interest. It might be that in the end, the UK end up with a decentralised app after all, but this could likely be due to technical difficulties experienced by the only other country that's using this method, Australia, who tried the centralised route first. So I think it would be really interesting to know how the discussion went with the DPO and the CISO around privacy and security by design requirements of this app. Now, let's go over to Gloria and Steve to lift the lid on this topic. So first of all, I'm going to hand across to Gloria to ask what the difference is between a few of these concepts. So, privacy by design, data protection by design, and a data protection impact assessment. They can all be quite confusing concepts, I think, to our DPO community. So, Gloria, can you just help us unpack each of these, please?
No problem. So I will start with privacy by design. So a privacy by design is really a concept, an approach whereby the controller looks to implement technical and organizational measures to comply with GDPR principles and the data subject rights. And in doing so, they need to look at the scope of the processing activity, the purpose for which information is being processed, and also the risk to the data subject. So really what this is a concept by which data protection is baked in to any sort of process or system right at the beginning of the planning stage to make sure that all parts of data protection is governed. And the interesting bit about privacy by design is that it covers all data protection activities and processing activities, whereas moving on to data protection impact assessments, they are more concerned with just looking at those risks, those processing activities which are likely to have a high risk to the data subjects' rights and freedoms. So there's two differences there. One is looking at data protection across the board, so it's a much wider scope. And the other one, DPIA, is looking at a very much more specific area, potential high risk processing of information. Those are two main differences.
Great, I think that's really, really helpful for people to understand specifically, especially when you're trying to communicate that across an organisation. So, for example, and Steve, you might want to pick up on this piece first. What considerations do you need to allow from an architecture or a security perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Vic, and thanks, Gloria, for that definition. Because first of all, it is privacy by design and data protection impact assessments. PIAs are all get a little bit confused across our community, and if we're confused amongst our community, you can imagine how hard it is for our stakeholders and our audiences to understand what the hell we're talking about when we say, have you considered the privacy implications? And they go, ooh. And I mean, to your point about your question about the security and privacy implications, you know, Gloria's definition is spot on. You know, privacy is all encompassing. Privacy is not just about sort of specific activities that you might be doing and processing as a controller or a data processor, but this is conceptual things that what's going to be the impact, you know, on society. And that's why this sort of COVID-19 applications that have been developed by the digital arm of the NHS is so pertinent, and you know, obviously in the current pandemic crisis, this is such a pertinent thing, because we have to look broader and we have to think beyond what are we specifically doing with this data. We have to look at the implications, you know, in a year or 2 years time, when hopefully we have we're all inoculated and basically we can stop this horrible disease, and then what happens to the data, and then who has access to the data, not just because of the security implications, but just about the sort of, you know, ethics of what we're doing with that data. And that's where privacy by design, certainly from my experience, has always been where you know generally start sitting in a room with blank sheets of paper with your solutions architects, with your designers, with whoever it is that's got a vested interest in this, and you just brainstorm and you think about what the privacy implications are for what it is you're going to do, how it's going to be perceived. Is it spooky? Is it creepy? You know, you know, what's the, and then get onto the legal processing or the purpose. And then other things that you'd want to consider in that is minimization, you know, data limitation, and all those kind of good concepts. And I think the security is a big part of that, because you're constantly playing off the what if scenarios of, you know, what would happen if, for example, hackers were able to get hold of this location data, or this data which potentially then could be linked to medical records, which obviously identifies a person. So the whole process of privacy by design is a conceptual one that, and which is why it's so hard to kind of demonstrate, you know, what good looks like in that process. But we're more to that as we speak over the next half an hour, so I don't want to give too much away too soon. So back to you.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So we're talking interchangeably as well about privacy and security. So it's kind of back to you, Gloria. I just want to pick up on that privacy and security point, because do you think that people might actually get confused between those two things and think that perhaps they are one and the same, which is why, and I know that, you know, we're going to look to try and unpack the DPIA process in a second, but do you think that that's why potentially some of the privacy implications might not be considered as high risk as the security implications, perhaps?
Hi, yes, and that's a really interesting question, because I've in my profession, I've actually experienced that where the company I had worked at would confuse security with privacy and think they were one of the same things, and that I would be a security expert, which I'm not. But I think the main difference, and I think the way that people can easily try and understand it, is that data protection, security covers everything, whereas data protection or privacy concerns personal data, the individual. So you might have some aspects of data protection where the process doesn't concern security at all. It has no, security is not part of that element. So it's important to understand that data protection doesn't always have to concern security, but when you're looking at security, it would always concern personal data. So it's they're two of one things, but at the same time they work together. You can't have one without the other. But it's very important to understand that even though you may have the security measures in place, you don't necessarily have the privacy elements in place. So it's not to say that one is more important than the other, but it just needs to work alongside each other. And that's the way that you can reach proper compliance. And also, I think in the general sense, most people are most concerned with the security of their information because of the repercussions of what could happen if the information was to get into the wrong hands. So I think that's why usually the security element of data protection is mostly publicized. You know, we hear about the breaches, etc. And those are the ones that hit the headlines, and those are the ones that are much more exciting and much more probably relevant and more understandable to individuals. So that is why it's the main focus in that. But that's not to say that every other aspect of privacy isn't important, because if you look at it, the fines, the way the fines are allocated to data in the GDPR, it shows that sort of the core obligations, the core foundations of Data Protection Act, the fines are actually bigger than even the data breaches. So in that sense, it shows how data protection, those elements of data protection where security is not a concern, is actually very important. The privacy aspect is hugely an important thing, and it's fundamentally engraved in human rights. So for me, I think I'm rambling on again like Steve, but I think for me, it's just really important that we don't separate it, as in we don't work together, but we acknowledge the difference, but it's something that coincides, but there are elements of privacy that have no concerns with security, and I think it's just about outlining that and making that very clear to individuals. Hopefully I've done that there, but that's what I believe.
Thanks, Gloria. No, I think that was really, really well explained, and I think that that is the type of explanation that needs to be given, by the DPO and by the CISO within an organisation to help them fully understand their risk. Steve, I think you wanted to pick up on that point as well.
Well, I mean, Gloria just did a great job, as I knew you would do. So thanks for that. I think what you're touching on is a really topical for DPOs and CISOs, and in fact, when I wore both hats at John Lewis, this was one of the biggest dilemmas about sort of, what's the implications here? Could this be used for discrimination purposes? Is it proportionate? And all of these, what's the purpose, and how do we protect the rights of the individuals? Those were all the questions that, when I talked to my left side of my brain, when I was just thinking about the security and the confidentiality and integrity, it just didn't come into play. And I think what's happened, unfortunately, and this is slightly controversial, is that what we've seen, as you touched on, Gloria, is that the DPAs, the data protection authorities, they've just focused on breaches. So they're almost going in on if you like, the easy pickings, the easy wins, because they've had a breach. It's obviously something's happened. But in actual fact, what we've probably got is quite a prolific misuse and wrong determination of lawful basis, and going on throughout Europe and beyond, I dare say. And because of the way the fines are structured and the enforcement of those fines, we've focused in on the wrong things almost. We're so obsessed with data breaches and data incidents and what's the cause, and instead, are we really asking ourselves as a society, like with the COVID tracking app, are we asking ourselves, what is this proportionate? What is what's the purpose? Where's this going to be stored? For how long? Who's going to have access to it? Now, I've been reading a lot about some really good publications on this, and there are lots of strong points of view on this, and you do get the sort of decentralized model and the centralized model, which obviously we've gone down the centralized model, and so have France, and so have Denmark. But yes, interestingly, Australia did reverse on their earlier decision. But I think the trouble is, there isn't a right or wrong. I think more to the point, which I think what Gloria was alluding to, is that you've got to make sure that this is an inbuilt process into your business, and that it's given the due care and attention it deserves. And that's a subject which I'm quite passionate about. How do we operationalise privacy by design? And the only other point I just wanted to mention was, certainly at John Lewis and beyond, we've created guidelines or playbooks and for our architects, for our people to consider, for our developers, our app developers, etc. And that's a really good way to try to help them to start think differently, because we've all come from this background of, oh, I've got to stop the breach from happening, and that seems to be the mindset. Well, as long as security is covered, then we're fine. Well, no, wrong. You could be using the data inappropriately, and you could be basically trampling all over someone's individual rights. And so that's the point about privacy by design, and the data protection impact assessment process is just a way of formally identifying a methodology, if you like, of identifying that and systematically treating it, and putting that sort of gate process that's become so much normal in the security world that we've seen. That's so much more mature, that everybody knows it has to be signed off by security. Now, as DPOs, we should also be signing off to make sure that we've protected the rights and freedoms of those individuals, that we've got the correct lawful basis, that we've got proportionality, we've got data minimization, all those good things that should be in that design process.
Great. Thank you, Steve. So I just want to really pick up and dig in a little bit more on the DPIA process in the context of what we're talking about, the COVID-19 Health App. I think we're sort of touching on, some of the areas that we might want to think about. Gloria mentioned at the beginning that we need to start this process early. So Gloria, actually, I'll come back to you and ask, do you think the requirements of GDPR have helped here, or potentially are they slowing down the development of life-saving techniques? Steve mentioned proportionality. The requirements of this DPIA assessment. What would actually have happened in reality when considering putting this app out on the market from the privacy perspective?
I think with regards to this, usually, yes, the DPIA would happen right at the beginning, and it would be thoroughly assessed and looked at. But with the COVID-19 app, I have the sense that obviously it's been quite rushed. And so I think sometimes in certain situations, you need to take a pragmatic approach and a view. I still think a DPIA needs to be completed, but the important thing about a DPIA, it's not just a one-off process. It's something that you will continue to update, to look at throughout the whole project cycle. And I think the best way to look at it is with regards to how we report a breach, for example, where there's a 72 hours obligation, but the ICO has said that if you still don't have all the information, just report it anyway, and you can continue to update us after that. And I think the same approach needs to be taken in some extent with DPIAs. So in this situation, if the necessary, all the checks were done, it would have probably taken a lot longer for the DPIA to be completed and to be more thorough. But because of the situation that we are in, I think that there needs to be some kind of balance in place. And as long as the DPIA has been completed and it's in place, they can continue to update it. I do feel that in terms of transparency, it's not too good. I think people are still very unclear as to what this app is asking of individuals. So there's some things I think that we can't compromise on when it comes to DPIAs. So when you carry out a DPIA, at the beginning, at the forefront, you know what you want to do with that information. So you know the process and activities and what information you want to collect. So I think that information should always be completed, and it doesn't need to take that long to do. But if you are looking at the risk and trying to ascertain what the risks are, that could be quite a longer process, and potentially the DPIA might need to, the project might need to come out before the DPIA or the risks have been identified, because potentially sometimes you don't even know what the risks are until after the project is launched. And that's why it's really important that DPIAs are part of the project cycle, are integrated within the project cycle, and are continuously, periodically reviewed and looked at. And where it needs to be updated, it is updated. And I think this will be the case with this COVID-19, because at the moment I know that people raise quite a few security risks, and they probably need to go back to their DPIA and amend it. So yeah, I don't think it's sort of black and white. It's something that's ongoing that needs to be reviewed, and that's what I feel that needs to happen. And it's also supported by sort of the 29 Working Party, the European Data Protection Board's guidance on DPIAs, that it's not just a one-off exercise.
Thanks, Gloria. So how often do you think, and it sort of feels like, DPIA as part of a larger project could be a living document, a living assessment. It's possibly an iterative process as well. But once it's actually finalised, how often do you think it should be revisited?
So I think it depends. So if something has changed, definitely needs to be revisited. If nothing has changed, that's obvious. It still needs to be looked at, because you need to make sure that the measures that have been suggested to mitigate those risks have been put in place. So it's not something that is, like I say, it's black and white. So if there's been a significant change to the process and activity, or new risks that have been identified, look at the DPIA again straight away. But if it's been finalised and the process and activity has gone ahead, I still think that you need to review the DPIA periodically, depending on the project. It could be annually, it could be every couple of years, or every 6 months, depending on what the product is. In sense of COVID-19, I probably think monthly, because it's new. It's something that's new, and it's a new technology. It's quite high. It's very high risk, and the information that it's processing is special category data. So these are all different elements that you need to consider when thinking about how often you will review a DPIA. It's not as easy as it's not a one size fits all, and you need to scale it to what the process and activity is. So it's basically a case by case basis. And I think that's a difficult element of DPIAs, because many people want a one size fits all, but unless you're processing the same thing every time, it won't be the case. It will be time intensive, and it will be a one size case by case process. And I think that's something that organisations like the NHS, organisations that need to consider when they implement DPIAs, they need to consider that into their processes and into their project cycles, that a DPIA is an ongoing, and it's quite a labour intensive process, and it's not going to be done like that. So.
Thanks, Gloria. Yes, quite right as well, because as you mentioned right at the beginning, when you broke down the difference between privacy by design and DPIA, mentioned that the DPIA is focused on something that automatically is high risk. So it's something that you do need to keep an eye on, a close eye on. So it would be reviewed regularly, but I expect potentially some organisations might struggle with a project not coming to an end. So when is it going to be AU? Is it going to be a 6 monthly review for a certain risk, or an annual review? And I think that's probably what we're used to with other types of projects. So it is interesting. In terms of sign off then, you know, should the data protection officer, and this is actually a question that's come in, so I'll ask this of you, Steve, should the DPOs sign off or advise the organisation so they can determine the approach to take in an informed manner? So I think that's in relation to a DPIA, to say it's done now, you can confidently go forward.
Yes, is the short answer, and certainly in my experience, what we did was, for some of the really tricky data protection impact assessments, and I'll come on to PIAs as well. So certainly on some of the trickier ones, we had agreed with the data owners that in certain cases I would escalate as DPO if I felt that I couldn't sign off on it, because you may find yourself, and I often did, where you were compromised because of the, you know, the rights and the freedoms, or the potential harm to the individual, you know, in your because often, you know, DPOs, just like CISOs, you know, less so nowadays, but are often dragged in at the last minute or retrospectively after the application's gone live. And, you know, I think what we're doing in our minds all the time as DPOs is, it's not just, you know, there's the legal ramifications of this, and that's something that could run a cropper, or with the COVID NHS app, but you've also got to look at the physical, emotional and material impact of that to that individual. And as a DPO, you know, I'm often thinking, okay, well, I put myself in their shoes, and I try to think, well, how would I feel if this information was, you know, compromised, or if this information was shared with people, or I didn't know about it. And it's a much more emotive, you know, thing. And I think this was one of the fundamental changes of GDPR, because GDPR essentially put the individual back in control of their data, and in doing so, the organisations that have your data, which is just loaned to us as organisations, it doesn't belong to us. We have to now, the emphasis is on us as organisations and DPOs. We now have to prove we did everything in our power to try to make sure the appropriate controls or proportionate controls were applied, and so that really was the fundamental sea change, as far as I can see, about bringing in GDPR. Was suddenly we have to prove that we've done everything in our power, whereas in the past, if you had data stolen and you were financially impacted by that through fraud or something else, then you had to go to court and you had to prove. Now the emphasis is completely switched, and as an organisation who have responsibility of that data. So the DPIA process is, in essence, your get out of jail card, to prove that you thought it through, you captured decisions, rightly or wrongly, and we will see, only time will tell with the COVID app. We will see what happens with this, but you need to have that evidence. You need to be able to say, well, look, we looked at this, we looked at the implications, we've thought about the proportionality, the minimization, the purpose, etc. We addressed the risks by stipulating all these controls, these safeguards like pseudonymization or encryption, etc. So we deemed it to be okay. But as I said, in my example, and certainly in my experience, I had many cases where I had to escalate up to the chief marketing officer or up to the chief HR director, both of which were on the board, and put to them why I felt as DPO I can't personally sign it off, even though I can understand the reasons, I can understand why you've got these objectives. So remember, we're meant to be impartial as a DPO. We are there to be the conscience that questions why, not just the legal basis, but actually that sort of emotive basis that, that material basis. We're there to ask those awkward questions, and that's what makes our role really sometimes unpopular, but also is why we so desperately need to ensure that our DPI process has the right escalation routes and has the right people behind you to make potential changes, which, let's be honest, could cost thousands, if not tens of thousands and millions of pounds in redevelopment cost if the DPO, for example, wouldn't sign off on it. And I don't think there's many situations that many of us wouldn't sign off on it, but we might have to make compromises or what we call compensating controls that sort of balance out those points of view and those things that we want to address.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, it's another area where I think awareness and education again is really key, so that people understand that this isn't perhaps a black and white process. It is iterative. It could be quite emotive, and it's not quite as binary as maybe some of the other areas in IT, for example. So Gloria, I'm just going to ask you, what about the harm principle? How does that fit into all of this?
I think it's something that as a sort of data protection professionals, DPOs, they need to consider how process and activities can affect individuals. It's like Steve was saying.
Stephen. Normally my mother does when I'm in trouble.
My brother's name is Stephen. Is that it's something that I think what's happening sometimes is that when people, the professionals look at data protection laws and look at risk to individuals, again, they're just looking at the law, the letter of the law. They're not really, as Steve said, thinking about the individual. They're not thinking about how this affects the individual. And throughout the whole GDPR, the whole purpose of the GDPR is about protecting the rights and freedoms of the individual. And so even before you consider what the risk is to the business, the risk is to another department, etc., you need to look at what the harm or the potential consequences to the individual. And I think from my experience, the best way to try and assess that is by creating sort of a risk matrix, whereby you would see what the likelihood of a risk would be to an individual, and the impact of the consequences of that process and activity to an individual. And then from that, you can see what the potential harm is. And one of the things I think is really helpful is to categorize what the potential impact would be. So it could be, the harm could be financial, it could be a physical, it could be mentally, it could be reputational, and it could just affect the whole privacy. And I think it's really important to assess that against the likelihood with your process and activities. And from that, you would know what the harm is. And I think that's one of the key things with the privacy impact assessments that many companies are struggling with, is how to assess the risk, how to measure the harm to an individual. And it's, if you don't have a fancy system in place or tool in place that can come up with that algorithm, then it's left to your own devices to do that. And I think it's really important to look at a methodology that works for your business. And way that you do that is to understand what your business is, and it's what the products and services are with your business. If you don't understand that, then you won't necessarily know what the potential risks are and what the impacts will be on individuals. So it's really important when you're looking at privacy impact assessment that you also know how you're going to assess what the methodology that you're going to use to assess the impact on individuals. And one methodology I like to use is the 5x5. I think that's a very clear and easy way to look at the overall risk to an individual. And it's something that I think is supported by the GDPR and the ICO, in terms that it looks at the likelihood and severity of any harm to the individual.
Thanks, Gloria. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, we've talked about harm and those kinds of 5x5 risk matrix models for many years, but we're not normally looking in business, in organisations, at individuals. We're looking at business operations. So I think, again, that's where it becomes quite difficult when potentially from a security perspective you're looking at the business, and from the privacy perspective you're looking at the individual, and somehow you've got to bring those two requirements, concerns, risks together, and communicate those and come to a decision. So we've got a final question here, Steve. I'm going to put that to you, and I think, you know, we've kind of been unpacking that this probably isn't something that can be adequate. However, it might be, to some of Gloria's points about methodology, that it could be a good start. So do you think a DPIA that has a form of a questionnaire can be adequate? I've seen DPIAs like that, but I doubt that you can assess something by ticking a yes or a no. I put that one to you, Steve.
Yeah, that's a good question that come through, and one that comes up often. I think it's fair to say that there has to be some start in the process, and that can be a questionnaire. Let's be honest, though, in fact, yes, several of my clients, you know, their problem has been that the PIA and the DPIA process is actually causing a bottleneck, slowing down innovation and and development, or if they want to do profiling, or whatever the cause is that they want to do it. So there is a balance to be had here about putting in due care and process where you can capture the appropriate risks, as Gloria said, and that's really, really important to demonstrate you've done your risk matrix. But let's be very clear. One of the biggest problems that DPOs or privacy officers have is that where do you get the balance between doing too much and not enough? And so my advice has always been the sort of 80-20 rule, that essentially 80% of what changes are happening in an organization, in a business, should be a level of self-assessment. In other words, if you put in place a questionnaire and you use Google Forms or whatever you use in your office, or not office, as the case may be nowadays, then you should be able to filter through the ones that are of greater harm, and that can be done. And I've done this a few times. I've done this at a bank. I've done this in many different environments, because really what you want is that initial privacy impact assessment to be able to tell you whether or not you need to go in and do a full DPIA. And sometimes you just don't need to. You don't need to go to that full extent. So there's a sort of tiered approach to this that needs to be considered, and where possible implemented. But going back to the question that come from the audience, yeah, a questionnaire is fine, but don't expect to really understand what they're going to do with the data, and and all these sort of harm questions that we've been touching on, proportionality and the limitation and the purpose and all those good things. And don't forget, that we are encouraged, and I'm not sure how many organisations do this, we are actually encouraged to work with our Data Protection Authority, the ICO here in the UK, if we are about to conceptually create something that we think could capture a lot of personal data. You can use them as a sounding board, and I have done that. When I was at John Lewis, we wanted to do some interesting things with the data sets between Waitrose and John Lewis. And I went to the ICO, and they were really incredibly helpful, in fact. So there is, it is necessary to have some form of checklist or some sort of, something that people can complete, so that you can filter out the ones that are really going to have an impact. And what I mean by that, is like sensitive data. So medical records or data like of that nature. Of course, you've got to do a DPIA, but your audience don't know that. Your staff, they don't know that. They just know that it's personal data, so they might not realise that that could be seen as discrimination. That could be seen, as something negative. And that's your job, is to give that balanced view, and then formally assess that where appropriate. But not everything has to be done by the Privacy Office. You can do this 80-20 that I've suggested.
Thanks, Steve. And just before we wrap up, Gloria, is there any sort of practical advice that you would give your fellow data protection managers and data protection officers at this time, when they're kind of grappling with questions about Wi-Fi tracking, app development, or measuring body temperature even in this period?
The advice I would give, and it's kind of touching on what Steve said, is to in a way keep the forms that need to be completed simple. And I think the reason why I think people find it very difficult to probably engage or implement DPIAs is because sometimes you overcomplicate things, and also know your audience, know who you need to who needs to complete those DPIAs, and make sure that it's in layman terms, because many of the people that do need to complete those forms, and if they are doing carry out a sort of self-assessment, are not privacy professionals, so they won't understand some of the terminologies. And sometimes I've seen some forms that are very legalistic, and people just don't understand it. So you need to make sure that the starting points of when a DPIA is required is easily accessible and is easily understood by the workforce. Another point is for people to become sort of engaged in what the new technologies are, PETs and privacy technologies, enhancing technologies, privacy enhancing technologies, and to be familiar with the new technologies around there, and for the business to encourage people to actually become up to date and know what's there. Because if the people are not aware of the new technologies, how will they know to fit that into the privacy by design elements in the company? So I think it's really important as well to keep up to date with what's going on in the privacy world and how that can be applicable to what you're doing in your company. And I think this whole thing with COVID-19 NHS app is a really good example in showing how looking at different elements of a DPIA and how important that is a necessary function, that it can't be ignored. It needs to be implemented, and it needs support from the business to properly make sure that compliance is met. So I think these are just some of the key top tips that I have for people. But I just think the main thing is try and keep it simple. Where you want people to engage with the Privacy Office or the Privacy Team or DPIAs, make it simple and make it attractive to people to come and seek for your advice.
Thank you so much, Gloria. I think that's really, really well explained, really clear, really pragmatic advice. I'm so glad that you joined us today to talk about this topic. Steve, would you like to say something? Yes, he's nodding at me. He definitely wants to say something.
Oh, I just, I really wanted to build on what Gloria said, which was spot on. Thank you. I mean, the KISS principle, keep it simple, is just brilliant. I think there's 4 things, and I'm going to whiz through these. So one thing I will say is Nathan, the editor and the guy who makes this all happen, the magician, as I call him, he's suggested that we put some of these tips on our website. So I know you're probably going to come back to that anyway, Vic, after this, so that other people can come back and look at what we've said. There are 4. So first of all, the first and foremost, as you would know, because that's why we're in this business together, is education. If you educate your people and give them the tools and the techniques, you can absolutely kill off a lot of these questions and a lot of these challenges that if you're being snowed under. Just educate people, do training for your developers, for your IT, for your technology teams. The second is around the risk assessment process, which Gloria said. Make sure you've got your matrix, your 4x4, your 6x6, whatever it is, but just make sure you've got the ability to identify and assess those potential risks in a systematic way. And don't forget, within that, we had a harm reference table which allowed us to quickly look up. So we made the process as slick as possible internally because we were getting so many DPIAs. The third is around, don't forget to get the views of the data subjects themselves. We often did focus groups, working groups with members of the public or customers of John Lewis, where we actually said, how would you feel if we were to do this? And you'll be surprised at, and that's all about transparency and links into Gloria's earlier point about how this isn't a one-off exercise. This is a repetitive process. I mean, I've updated privacy notices probably on average about every quarter because something's changed and it needed, or it certainly needed me to go in and review it again. So that whole transparency. And then finally, fourth point is around integration, which you touched on, you're quite rightly, Vic, right at the beginning of this conversation about building that into your business as usual process, into change control, etc., etc. The more you can do, the better about integration. So that's it. But we'll possibly share those four and Gloria's tips on our website if I can convince Nathan to put that up for me.
Perfect, thanks Steve, and really nicely underlined there. I've really enjoyed the session this week. It's again very topical. It's really good to be able to give a really clear example for people and unpack that. As Steve touched on, you can go to our website, privacyculture.com/data matters, and find all previous episodes and shortly top tips by the sounds of it as well, which I think is a great idea. Next week we'll be looking at and unpacking data breach management, back to Friday, 2 p.m. BST as usual. Look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you for joining us, and thanks very much again to our guest Gloria.